We talk a lot about healthy habits, longevity, and resilience. But what if aging depends not only on what we do for ourselves, but on how we live with the world around us? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age. My guest is Tim Christophersen, a leading global voice on nature conservation and restoration, and author of Generation Restoration: How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. Tim's work challenges us to see that restoring ecosystems and restoring ourselves are deeply intertwined processes. In this conversation, we'll explore how to resist despair, draw wisdom from Indigenous traditions, and rediscover our sense of belonging in the natural world. Because aging well means living well in the only home we all share, Earth. Tim, welcome to the Aging Well podcast. Let's have you tell us a little bit about yourself and what sparked your interest in conservation.
Hi, Jeff. Great to be on the show. And I grew up in a small village in a rural setting. There's not much else to do than go fishing and hiking and camping and for long walks in the forest. So I think that sparked my love for nature. And nature has been my guiding principle throughout all my career. Over 25 years I've spent now working on this interface of conserving and restoring nature at large scale. It all came from my childhood, I assume.
So in your book, you describe a relationship crisis with Mother Nature. What does that look like in our practical terms, and how do you see it showing up in our daily lives?
Well, thanks for mentioning my book. I have one right here. Yeah. So it's called Generation Restoration. And I would like us to imagine this relationship with nature in a very literal sense, like you would have a relationship with a person. And I think we all know of relationships that are not healthy between people. So they're either codependent relationships or relationships that become in some way toxic. At the moment, that's the kind of relationship we have with nature, because we always ever take. We take resources, we take nature's ecosystem goods and services like clean water, we take, and we don't give back. If you're in a relationship like that, usually these relationships have to end one way or another because they can't be sustained. So just like in a human relationship that is headed for disaster, we're in a relationship crisis with nature because we only ever take. And you cannot be in a relationship like that. It has to become a reciprocal relationship again, like it was for many millennia before our time. And I think we can get to a new relationship with nature that takes into account technology and the future we want that is better for humans and for nature.
So I think for our viewers and listeners, it might be like, why talk about conservation on the Aging Well podcast? I think it really underscores what we often bring up, what we call our SPIES model, which is our wellness model, which is the spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social. That relation, we deal with relationships with one another, but the relationship with nature, with the physical universe, is just as important as it is with our social connections with other beings. And so you've worked globally in conservation and restoration. Where have you seen this disconnection from nature's impact with human health and well-being the most?
Let me throw in a little stat here to start with, because you mentioned health and aging well is certainly based on a healthy physical body, but also a healthy mind. And if you spend 120 minutes or more per week in nature and with nature, it lowers your cholesterol level, it lowers your blood pressure, it's good for your mental balance and well-being. There have been numerous studies to the degree that now in 35 US states and in places like Japan, across the EU, doctors now prescribe walks in nature instead of drugs, because it's not only better for you, it's also a lot cheaper for the medical system and for your insurance. So again, we should take this relationship with nature and what it can do for us very literal, because it has a real impact on human health. And then if you go to the other extreme, the link between human disease and nature is equally well researched. There are, for example, clear links between the spread of malaria and other vector-borne diseases in the tropics and deforestation. Because if you remove the forest cover and you have more open water pools, there's clearly a much higher level of malaria in places like Peru, Brazil, and other places where this has been studied. So, and there are many other aspects of a healthy and intact nature for our health, such as clean drinking water. In the book, I talk about 3 key principles of basic ecological literacy. So the first is, where does your food come from? This is something all of us should know if you want to age well and live long. Where does your food come from? Who's your farmer? How do they farm the food? How does it get to your plate? And the next question is, where does your water come from? Because we are mostly water-based as a life form, some carbon and some minerals in it as well, but our body needs a lot of water. It needs clean water. So where does your water come from? Which ecosystem, which part of nature captures, filters, stores, and then releases your water? 1/3 of all the cities in the world get their water from forest watersheds, for example. So where's your forest? Do you know where it is? Well, in Portland, you probably do, because it's pretty close to the city. But in other cities, people don't know where their water comes from. And then the third aspect is, what species do you share your home, your city, your country with? Who else lives sort of in your ecosystem, and what does nature do for the place where you live? Like lowering temperature and summer heat waves can literally save lives. So knowing these things about nature is, I think, are the basic steps to ecological literacy. And I think that to your question, where is this still healthy, this relationship, and where is it fractured? I think we can generally say that for people living in cities, of course, nature seems like something that's far away and that you have to get into your car to get to. But nature is always there, in the sense that we depend on nature even for functioning cities and functioning civilizational structures. So let's think about this relationship not only in terms of a national park somewhere that you like to take walks in, or your city park, but also what does nature do for us on an everyday basis? Because it's probably more than we think or realize.
Yeah, you're making me think of the period of time when I lived in New York and I was working in Manhattan, and we were just blocks from Central Park. So I was working in corporate fitness, and I would love to go running in Central Park just because it was an escape. If I didn't look up and look in my peripheral view, you had kind of the smell of horse manure from the carriages. You had some greenery and trees around, and it was, it's still probably not the most physically, best physical environment, because there was still probably pollutants coming around from everywhere else. But from a psychological standpoint, it was so nice to just be able to kind of escape the concrete jungle, and just for that brief run to be able to kind of be feeling like I was out in a more rural area. And it just had much more of a mental health benefit for me.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that Central Park was modeled after what at that time were mostly European landscapes that were shaped by humans. So they're with a mix of some open meadows, some water, some forest. These were landscapes that were mostly human shaped. And this again comes to one of our roles in nature, because in the book I'm trying to help all of us remember that we are part of nature. We have our role as ecosystem engineers, so we can actually shape and change nature, and we do that all the time, mostly not in a very deliberate and often in a negative way, but we can also do it in a positive way. And this idea that we can shape entire landscapes to be great for both nature and for humans is something we also need to remember. We have the ability to create landscapes that are fantastic for running and recreation, and fantastic for producing food, great for bird life, great for plant life, great for biodiversity at large. And that positive way of our impact on nature is, I think, also something that we need to remember. I'm trying to come back to your original question of what the links with our health, because I think that is such a central theme in why we need to repair this relationship with nature, because the health of the ecosystem we live in and our health is connected in many different ways, including the food that we eat and how many nutrients and micronutrients are in the food, and what the diversity and biodiversity in the soil is. There are amazing new studies now that show that the more biodiversity you have in the soil, microbes and earthworms and all the diversity that makes food grow, basically, the more diversity you have in the soil, the healthier the food is for the human body. So there's clearly a link between the health of nature and our health.
So what inspired Generation Restoration, and what do you hope the readers and listeners will take away from it?
Generation Restoration, it's not only the title of my book, it's also the hashtag of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. If you go on Instagram right now, you'll find around 140,000 organizations, people, projects posting about generation restoration for this global collective effort to restore nature at scale. And my book is a little bit halfway stock take of this United Nations collective effort, and also a bit of a manifesto for how to go forward to repair this relationship with nature in a way that's good for our economy, that's good for our societies, our communities. And what I hope readers and listeners will take away from it is that we have an enormous sense of agency. Because right now, when you read the news, especially about the environment and things like the climate and nature loss, it's easy to get discouraged, because we need to remember that we have all the power that we need to make a change. All it takes is a shift in our mindset and more collaboration across key sectors of society, often within our community, between public and private sector, where I work now for a large technology company after having spent 15 years with the United Nations. So that also showed to me this value of public-private collaboration. And restoring nature is also about restoring a sense of purpose and a sense of community. It's as much about restoring ourselves as it is about restoring nature.
If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast. So you emphasize the importance of Indigenous perspectives in shaping a more sustainable future. What are some of the most powerful lessons you've learned from Indigenous communities about living in harmony with nature?
In the book, I describe one of the many projects that are underway globally, and this is a very large one. It happens right now across all of South America. When you go to the Andes mountain range and go to high Andes, so sort of above 12,000, 13,000 feet, you come into an area that used to be densely forested by cloud forests, with this tree that looks like something out of the Lord of the Rings, this gnarled, lichen-covered trees that capture moisture from the clouds. But there's only 10% of that forest left, and there's a large-scale Indigenous-led effort underway by the local communities across all of the high Andes in 5 countries now to restore those forests. There's over 40,000 people spending their time volunteering in those harsh environments to replant trees. They've planted over 15 million trees in an effort called Acción Andina. And what I take from that project is that it's not only incredibly important also for all the non-Indigenous people who benefit, because that water will trickle all the way down to cities like Lima and provide the drinking water. it is this sense of reciprocity with the mountain ecosystem that triggers that enormous investment of time and effort by those people. They understand that if they don't give back to the mountain can't give them water because the glaciers are melting. There's not going to be water unless the forests are back to capture the water. So again, that sense of reciprocity that you have to give back to nature, even if it's just your attention. It can, in our case, of course, be money or time or dedication. But there has to be a reciprocity with nature, because otherwise the relationship will come to a halt, and that is really bad for us. It isn't for nature. Is it's not probably not the end of nature, but it would definitely be the end of civilization as we know it if ecosystem collapse is allowed to continue at the pace it is now. But we have absolutely all the tools, all the science, all the knowledge. We even have all the money. We need to turn that around and rebuild a healthy, abundant, diverse, natural world that can sustain us. Because aging well, it's not only about individuals, it's also about humanity at large. We age, we evolve, our civilization is aging and hopefully becoming wiser. It's something still to be hoped for. So aging well in this context, I think, is also about all of humanity. It's not only about each of us individually.
Very good points. And so you talk about this sense of relationship and reciprocity with the natural world. How do we begin to restore that, especially in a more modern urban environment?
So, many good relationships, they begin with good food, right? You meet other people through good conversation, good food, spending time together. It's not different with nature. If you think about what you eat, where your food comes from, and you do a bit of research of trying to find out how you can improve and give back to nature by what you eat, through what you eat, how you shop, where you buy your food, how you support regenerative agriculture, for example, that is a good starting point. And the other good starting point I speak about in the book is just to spend time with nature. The book doesn't have, like many books on the environment, doesn't have a long list of things you should do and how to recycle your plastic and all of that. That's all still important, but I think there's a more fundamental change that needs to happen, and that's how we view nature. And for that, you need time, which of course is for many of us is also our most precious commodity. So it's easier said than done, but do spend more time with nature, in nature, understanding nature, observing nature. And from that, there's a lot of lessons to be learned for what we should do differently. But it seems counterintuitive in our hectic world to say, I don't want you to do 10 things today to save the world. I want you to slow down and take a walk and immerse yourself in nature. Listen to nature. You'll learn everything that you need to do as an individual, as a community, from observing nature.
So it's pretty easy for me being kind of in the Portland area in Oregon. I mean, there's still so much. I mean, I can't drive too many places where I still can't see Mount Hood. I love my commute home because I can sometimes see, one of the Sisters Mountains. I can see Mount Hood. I can see sometimes Mount Rainier as well as Mount St. Helen. Those are just really cool days. We call them mountain out days, where it's really that clear. But, I think back to when I lived in New York and, aside from Central Park, which again is it's not a natural nature. It's, a man-made nature. How does somebody in those environments where, they look in all directions from where they live and they don't, quote unquote, see nature, how do you kind of encourage those people to connect with nature, and what should they do?
Well, nature is actually never far away from us because we, as our human bodies, are sort of walking ecosystems that have evolved over a long time with other non-human cells and species that we need to keep our skin healthy, to help us digest our food. So in a sense, we are also nature. You don't have to actually go even to Central Park. But if you're in a city like New York is actually surprisingly diverse in terms of bird habitat. It is very diverse in terms of the surrounding watershed. It has some forests, it has some meadows. What I would like to suggest to anybody who lives in a city is just be out then, if you want, in the elements, and take an hour to sit by the waterfront in New York, and then imagine that 100 years ago, New York was surrounded by billions of oysters. There were 200,000 acres of oyster reefs about 200 years ago around New York. Everything that's now the harbor, the Upper Bay, estuary of the Hudson River, all of that were oyster reefs. And they protected New York from storm surges. They provided an enormous amount of food. They were home to marine biodiversity, at different marine mammals, lots of different fish species. And that all disappeared. We could get it back, though, but for that, you need to sit there and listen to nature and see what is there, but also see what is not there. And imagine what could be there once again. There were once billions of oysters around New York. New York was actually known globally as one of the oyster capitals of the world, exported oysters to France, Germany, England. And the last commercial oyster bed in New York closed in 1927. The water of the bay, if they were back, would be crystal clear. You would be able to swim there because oysters filter the water once a day of that entire ecosystem. So if you don't have the nature of a beautiful national park, just spend time outside and imagine what your city could look like if it had natural wealth and abundance back at the levels that would help us sustain an amazing food chain in New York, an amazing storm defense against things like Superstorm Sandy, the next of which is definitely on its way, and whenever, in probably a few years, if not sooner. So how can we get back to that natural wealth? And I think spending that kind of time in nature and having that dialogue with your surroundings is important as well. Maybe AI can also help us generating the images and the visions and the actual image of what this did look like once and what it could look like again. But that would be my advice for New Yorkers. Think about the big oyster. New York should be called the Big Oyster, not the Big Apple, because it was surrounded by billions and billions of oysters.
Yeah, now there's probably neither oysters nor apples in Manhattan.
That's true. But there's a billion oyster project underway. So on Governor's Island and elsewhere, they're actually releasing oysters back into the wild. There's a lot of schools that are involved. There's some restaurants that are joining. And they are making headway, but we could accelerate those kinds of efforts multiple times in speed and scale if more people knew what we could gain, how much natural wealth we could get back within our lifetimes.
So I'm curious, is that campaign to reinstitute oysters into the Manhattan area, is that commercial or is it more environmental?
This is really an interesting question, because I think we're all used to nature being sort of things that the Nature Conservancy or Wildlife Fund, they do with some grants of people who have some excess money to give to good causes. But the significant difference of what has happened in the last 5 years is that nature restoration is becoming a very large industry. Because if you think of nature not as, it would be nice to have oysters in New York, but if we don't have oyster reefs, the next superstorm is going to wash away Manhattan. You're talking about different levels of investment. Then suddenly a few $1 billion is nothing compared to protecting the coastline of the world's financial capital, right? And with the voluntary carbon market, which channels money into nature for climate compensation, with investments in watershed restoration for drinking water, we're suddenly seeing this emerge as a fast-growing industry. So your question, is this sort of some do-good NGO grant money that you give some donations to? That's not going to be enough. We need billions of dollars, probably hundreds of billions in investments in this kind of natural infrastructure. But that money is absolutely available because we're used to investing money in infrastructure in all countries in the world.
Yeah, I think my question was a little bit more in regards to, are we looking to reinstitute oysters so that we can harvest them and eat them?
Oh,
or
absolutely.
are we
I love oysters.
maintaining looking at
No, they're not just for looking. I think our role in nature is, of course, as a guardian and as a steward of these landscapes, but we also benefit from nature, and we absolutely harvest from nature every day, whether it's plants or animals, and there's nothing wrong with that because we need to eat, right? So the question is how you do it. So there are techniques like permaculture, regenerative agriculture, agroforestry that can produce food and at the same time restore biodiversity and restore nature. But this is not about putting nature on some kind of pedestal or under a protective dome and never touch it again. We are part of nature, which means we would be part of these ecosystems of large oyster reefs, and you would see people going out there every day to harvest some oysters, which is perfectly acceptable and actually important, because when you attach value to nature in that way, you're also more likely to care for it and protect it rather than seeing it as something that just is a cost factor to the city's budget.
Yeah, I think we have this human tendency to want to exploit nature, and that's the biggest challenge, I think, when you look at restoration and sustainability, is how do we go about changing people's mindsets to where they understand that, yes, you can take from nature, but if you take too much, then you're depleting it and it's going to cause more harm. One of the most impactful exercises I ever had to do in my undergraduate years was to read and write a paper on the tragedy of the commons, which you're probably familiar with in your area, that 1968 essay by Garrett Hardin. And I still use that today with my students. And I teach exercise science, which you'd think, how does the tragedy of the commons play into exercise science? But I look at it from a healthcare standpoint. But I think it's one of the most impactful exercises I ever did, because it changed my mindset in terms of, I can't just take, because what I take, there's a bit of an opportunity cost in there. If I take, it's taking away from somebody else potentially. It may be stripping the environment in a way that doesn't allow it to restore itself. But if we can live with nature in a way that we are taking, but we're giving back more, and we're sustaining and actually building that ability for nature to give to us, then we've done something right. But I think, I don't know if we're there yet. And I don't know if you're more optimistic than me, or less optimistic, or the same.
I hope I'm very optimistic, and the book closes on a chapter called "The Stubborn Optimist." So it's absolutely the tone of the book. But to your point, in the tragedy of the commons, we all have to take from nature. So that is not the problem. It's whether you take too much or you don't take and give back, but only take. I think those are the problems. And again, we can learn from indigenous communities about governance structures that have successfully overcome the tragedy of the commons. And for them, it is the glory of the commons, because they benefit, all of them, and nature, from a governance system that has responsible harvest principles, like, don't take more than half, never take the first or the last of any species that you encounter in nature. So these are some indigenous principles that we would do very well with to rediscover and remember. And even Western culture is full of these cautionary tales. There's the fable of the goose that lays golden eggs. You're familiar with that tale of the farmer who suddenly discovered one of his geese is laying golden eggs, and after a while he becomes greedy and sort of he slaughters the goose to get all the eggs at the same time, only to find out it's just a goose like any other, and now she's dead and there's no more eggs. So we have these tales told to us, not only in indigenous culture but also in Western culture. I think we just would do well to remember that it's not about taking. We all need to take from nature. It's about how much we take and how we give back.
I like that theme of the glory of the commons. I'm going to have to steal that from you. I'll give credit to you, but I talk often about the tragedy of the commons, but yeah, I think it's a great way to reframe it and say, we can have the glory of the commons. There's not that we have to just totally abandon ourselves from taking from nature. We have to learn, like the indigenous people have long known, to live with nature. And so do you see restoration as primarily an ecological process, or is it equally social and spiritual?
I think it is very important what kind of intentionality we bring to restoration. And just pause here for a second and think about the roots of the word ecology. Ecology comes from ancient Greek, and oikos is our common household or our common home. It's the same root as the word economy, by the way. So economy is the management of our common home, and ecology is the knowledge of our common home. And those two things are not separate. It's actually very important that we link them again, because if we manage something without knowing how it works, that is a recipe for disaster. So ecology is very important for running our economy. And also when you go into restoration, it's very important to remember we're not doing this only for nature or just the intrinsic value of nature, although that can play a role. We're also doing it for the economy, for the management of our common home, because we need to manage these ecosystems through ecological literacy and the knowledge of how to restore these ecosystems. They are the basis of everything in our economy. We've just forgotten and just taken it for granted that, we have fish to eat and fruit and meat and vegetables and clean water. All of that comes from nature. Most of what my house here is built with comes from nature. So remembering that ecosystem restoration at the same time is restoring the fundamentals of our economy is very important. Otherwise, you get pushed into this corner of, there's somebody who talks a lot about nature, and that's priority number 10 out of 10 on my list. It's those days are past. We can no longer treat nature as a luxury that we can just take for granted and use up.
And as we kind of look at environmental news, people are on all different sides of global warming and the changes in the environment and stuff, but nobody can deny the frequency. I'm just north of California, and my brother-in-law's mother-in-law lost her home in the Palisades fires. What was that, about a year or two ago now? Time tends to blur. But you got fires and floods and different multiple extinctions going on. And how do you personally resist despair and stay grounded in hope as you go through what you're trying to do?
Yeah, let's first make it very clear that this is very real. Even if you don't believe the scientists about climate change, just ask anybody working in home insurance if this is real or not, because they will tell you it's very real. So staying optimistic is actually not something that just happens to you. In the last chapter on stubborn optimists, I use some wise words from Paul Romer, who's an economist, and he described that there's two kinds of optimism. One is unconditional optimism. It's like a child waiting for presents. You sit around and wait for the best. Not very likely to happen in our case. The other is called conditional optimism. That's the optimism we need, and it's a mindset more than something that happens to you. It's the optimism of a child wanting to build a treehouse. And if you have kids and they've ever pestered you so long with their enthusiasm until you say, okay, well, let's do this. And then they get all their friends and all their relatives, and everybody pools their knowledge and they collect all the tools. And suddenly you're building something really cool just because you have conditional optimism and you don't give up. You say, well, we can do this. We can do this. That's the kind of optimism we need. And that's self-perpetuating. It's actually a virtuous cycle that starts with hope, creates some action creates more hope. And then suddenly you find yourself in a very optimistic loop. So that's what the book is about. And hopefully gets more of us out of the lethargy that we can, you can become apathic almost when you only read the news and the headlines. But taking action is the best antidote to that, and it's the best way to become optimistic.
Yeah, and you've said that restoration can be contagious. You don't say it is contagious. You say it can be contagious. So what do you mean by that? And how does one act of care or renewal create momentum for more? And what role can individuals, especially as older adults, play in environmental restoration or community-based sustainability projects?
Yeah, so let's start with that generational aspect, because it's very important to me that the generation restoration, when we came up with that, also the hashtag for the United Nations decade, it was a signal to say this is not for a Generation X or the millennials or the boomers. It is for everybody who is alive on the planet today, and we need the wisdom and the wealth and the power of the older generations together with the enthusiasm of the younger generations who are not taking no for an answer to form these powerful restoration efforts. I believe once you have started to really do something with your hands in terms of restoring, something as simple as planting a tree or participating in a community garden project or joining a collaborative that looks at how food is produced or sourced, I think that is very contagious. It's a really positive way to improve your health, mental well-being, but also the community you live in. It's, of course, not easy to do in many places, but there are online platforms like restore.eco, that are sort of like the LinkedIn of ecosystem restoration projects. There's about 300,000 projects now online there, probably one near you, where you can see who's already working on this, who's already engaged in your neighborhood. There are platforms like Patagonia Action Works and many different platforms where you can find where to start.
So how do you see the connection between planetary health and human longevity? This is the Aging Well podcast, so I got to ask that question.
Yeah, this you probably know a lot more about this than I do. But if you look at the areas in the world that have a lot of people that live for 100 years or more, they always have one thing in common, and that is some level of simplicity of the food they eat. Diversity and nutritious food, yes, but not highly processed food. So the more our food is industrially processed, the more difficult it is for our bodies to absorb. So I think food plays a very, very important role for longevity. So it's not surprising that in many cases, these populations of centenarians who live for 100 years or more, they're in rural areas. But I think we can learn from that even when we live in cities. Just try to buy things in the supermarket that have no more than 5 ingredients. If there's anything on the ingredients list that you don't know what it is, you probably shouldn't buy it. Or that your mother or grandmother wouldn't have recognized, you probably shouldn't buy it. So try to eat as fresh as possible. And again, that's easy for me to say because we have a farm here and we eat most of our own vegetables and produce. So it doesn't get much fresher than that. And it's more difficult for people living in urban areas. But I think that would be my number one advice for longevity. And I'm sure that doctors would back me up on that.
Yeah, and even in an urban environment, there's an ability to connect with the food and produce some of your own food. It doesn't have to be everything. You're not going to raise the cattle in your apartment in Manhattan, but, you can grow vegetables indoors and with certain techniques. You can grow them on your, fire escapes. You can take land that is kind of just abandoned in the city and turn that into community, gardens and grow stuff. And it seems like in the blue zones where we have all these centenarians, that there's a greater connection with the food and making the food, and that joy that comes from actually having a part in what you're bringing to the table that has a contribution to our overall health and well-being.
Yeah, I think that's right, and the the link between food and our well-being also goes beyond just sort of the calories and the nutrients. I think there's a joy that you also need to connect with your food that is just irreplaceable, or it's I wouldn't say it's irreplaceable, but it's, if you grow your own food, there's a certain joy in it that really also contributes to your well-being in addition to having good food. So, and it's becoming more and more popular. I have friends in Paris and in London, and if they try to sign up for communal garden projects, there are long wait lists. People love to do these kinds of urban restoration projects, urban communal gardens. And if you go to cities like Havana and Cuba, out of necessity, they actually had to produce most of the fruit and vegetables that the city consumes within the city boundaries. So there's a lot of urban gardening happening at large scale that can actually produce significant amounts of food, even for an urban population. So again, it's up to us how much of that we want in our cities. Not that it's impossible; it's just a matter of choice. I think we have to. We can make our voices heard and say, for empty lots in London, priority should be to turn these into community gardens instead of another parking lot or another office building.
Yeah. So what gives you the most hope about this generation's ability to restore balance, both ecologically and spiritually?
I think the most hope is when I look around at how much is already happening. It's almost like when you don't read the headline news for a day, but instead you go to pages 5 or 7 in your newspaper and look for the good news, because there's always some good news as well. The more you do that, the more you discover there's like a groundswell of this collective consciousness that we are part of nature. People are remembering that we're part of nature. And I think it's because we see the impacts coming closer and closer of this perceived distance from nature, and that has impacts like pollution, like climate change, like nature loss. We see that starting to impact our lives, and people are remembering that we're part of nature. I think there's a positive social tipping point that is about to occur in the next few years. So we can all push for that. It will be better for all of us, regardless where you are on the political spectrum, by the way. It doesn't matter if you're left or right or blue or green or red. What matters is that we all want clean water. We all want good food. We all want healthy communities where we can grow up in connection with nature. These things are pretty universal, so that makes me hopeful as well. We have more in common with people from across the political spectrum than we think on this topic.
So if you can leave the listeners with one message about what it means to age well in the context of your work, what would it be?
It would be enjoy aging, in the sense that with age comes wisdom, hopefully, for, I think, many of us. And for me, that is such a gift that it's well worth celebrating getting older, because everything else is in the mind. It's a mental attitude. But that gift of wisdom that does come with experience and sometimes with age is something to be celebrated.
I think too, as we age, the contribution that we make to improve our environment is all the more apparent. You plant a tree and you get to watch that grow. I forget who. I think it was like I think it might have been like Shel Silverstein or something like that. Had kind of a famous article or story cartoon that he wrote. Showing kind of the person planting the tree, and then the tree grows and they're able to swing on it, play on it, and then they bring their grandkids on to do the same thing, and then eventually it kind of gets to where the tree gets chopped down, but then they have a place to kind of sit on the stump of that tree, and just that whole involvement in nature can be all part of our pathway to aging well.
I love that. I think that's very beautiful. And I think, indeed, wisdom is planting a tree, even if you know that you will never sit in its shade, but still doing it because it is for coming generations as well. So that looking forward 7 generations into the future is another indigenous wisdom that I think we've forgotten and would do well to remember.
Yeah, that's a great quote there. And so, kind of off topic, but not off topic a little bit. This is the Aging Well podcast. What are you doing personally to age well?
Well, I wish I would actually do more, to be honest, because I have a job that I wouldn't necessarily call stressful, but I do travel a lot and there's not enough time to exercise always. I just try to spend time with nature. That is my thing, and that's why we bought this farm here a couple of years ago, and because it allows me to work from home, but also every day, whenever I have a break, I can spend time with the animals, can spend time in our little forest and on the fields. So I hope that makes up for a gym membership, which I don't have, because I don't like going to the gym.
Well, I mean, I'm an exercise physiologist, so the tendency is to think the gym is the most important aspect of our health and well-being. But the reality of it is, I don't know that as I've looked at the different stories about people in the blue zones, very few of them are talking about they're living to 100 years of age because of the Gold's Gym around the block that they go to every day. It's that they're engaged in their communities, they're engaged in their environment, they're eating food that is healthy and of nature, not loaded with a bunch of chemicals, and that's what it really takes to live well. So I'm kind of jealous of you that you can live on that farm and work with the animals. I would love to be in a position to have horses and do some of that kind of stuff, because I had one job where I was able to just go out. Campus had a horse stable, and I taught a part of an outdoor rec class. I taught the mountain biking side of it, but I could just go at any point, just take a horse out of the stable and go for a ride around campus. And it was the most relaxing thing I think I've ever done in my life. And so you're doing more for aging well than you really think you are. Don't worry about going to the gym. Think about the food that you're producing and eating, your engagement with nature, your social connectedness, your living with purpose, you're literally trying to change the world. I think that's more admirable than being able to track on your smartwatch how many steps you got, or how many hours you spent at the gym, what your heart rate was in your last workout.
Yeah,
So I think
have
you're
a
doing
great
well.
role model who's also connected to the book. Jane Goodall wrote the foreword to my book, and she passed away in October, and the book was published 2 weeks after. But until age 91, Jane would actually travel the world 300 days a year. She was such a amazing character who would make that her life's purpose, because she told me once that it was so important for her to spread hope and make that part of her mission, that it just kept her going and going and going. And she did not suffer from any disease or illness. Her death of natural causes was very sudden. So in a way, that is also, for me, a great role model that, of course, well, she lived into her 90s, which I think is long, but how you live and that you live well to the last is also very important.
Yeah, I'm jealous that you have that friendship. That's kind of amazing role model to have. And yeah, it was, I don't know, say it was shocking to kind of hear about her death just a couple months ago or a month ago. But, any picture I've seen of her or video I've seen of her over the last decades, they're great for a 90-year-old. I mean, women, she lived well, and, not too many people make the contribution to the world that she has made. So
yeah, we all
definitely
miss
an
Jane,
example
but
of
it's up
living
to
well.
us now to carry her legacy forward, because we can all be inspired.
Right.
We can all be a little bit like Jane Goodall and try to live into our 90s with purpose and with conviction and determination.
So, is there anything we neglected to talk about in today's conversation? I feel like we could probably go down all kind of different pathways with sustainability, ecology, restoration. Anything you want to make sure you underscore for our viewers and listeners?
I should probably add that my day job also has to do with restoration. I work for a tech company called Salesforce, and we invest a lot in restoration. So I get to visit a lot of projects where we help large-scale restoration. But I just wish more companies would do more, because if any of your listeners work for large companies, encourage them to invest more in these types of activities, in water resilience and ecosystem restoration. So I think it's really important for companies to also walk the talk and make these kinds of investments. And we'd love to partner with large companies on this who also want to be on the nature journey.
So where can our viewers and listeners connect with you? Is there a website? Do you have social media? And of course, where can they find the book?
On timchristophersen.com and on all the online platforms, Amazon, wherever you want to buy a book, or go to your brick and mortar bookstore around the corner and order there, Generation Restoration. And the best way to interact with me is on LinkedIn. I have an Instagram account, but I don't really do well on Instagram yet. It's my kids try to teach me, but it's work in progress. So LinkedIn is the best option.
No TikTok?
No TikTok. Never actually even seen a TikTok video. This is probably something I should change, but hasn't.
How old are your children? How old are your children?
They're 17. Our son is 17. Our daughter is 14.
And you haven't seen TikTok? Good for you. You're raising those kids well.
Instagram, yes, and shorts on YouTube and everywhere, but no TikTok.
That's good. So I have really enjoyed this conversation. I love what you're doing, and I love that we are able to connect this with aging well. And I hope that our viewers and listeners will take to heart the glory of the commons and do their part to participate in that. And just keep doing what you're doing. Keep aging well.
Thank you, Jeff. It was a pleasure. Great to meet you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.